Hamburg, Germany, December 1938. 4 years into Adolf Hitler's reign as Führer, he is beginning to establish his total dictatorship by taking direct control of the German military. But on the brink of World War II, Hitler is also involved in much stranger endeavors that are hidden to the public. He is committing every remaining resource to searching for ancient relics that he believes could hold incredible powers.
They were looking all over the world, and that included Antarctica.
The Thule Society actually believed that there were mystics or channels who were able to communicate with these beings who claimed to be either extraterrestrial in origin or claimed to belong to this civilization that lived in Earth's interior. They gave a lot of information about the building of advanced aerospace vehicles, flying saucers, and I think this is where Hitler's Nazi Party got a lot of its information about Antarctica, that in Antarctica there is this ancient civilization or bases where they could find a lot of these advanced technologies.
Hello, Plastic Pills listeners. I hope you're all doing well and surviving in the midst of the apocalypse. But we're very excited today for a very special episode where we have not just Professor, but Sir Richard Evans with us today to talk about his new book, The Hitler Conspiracies. Professor Evans, for those of you who don't know, is the author of the Third Reich trilogy, which I went through over the holidays. And I can say that it's not often you see the word magisterial applied to books any longer, but if anything warrants the title, certainly the Third Reich trilogy does. Quite definitive. So thanks a lot, Professor Evans. It's really a delight to have you here.
Pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, excellent. So our first question is just, you wrote a 3-volume opus on the Third Reich, which covers virtually every aspect of its history, military policy, culture, you name it. What motivated you to return to the subject matter for this new book, The Hitler Conspiracies?
Well, I began to notice after the book came out, the third volume in 2008, that conspiracy theories, which I'd considered long since debunked, were beginning to come back into the mainstream. So I thought this is an important and rather worrying development. And I got a grant to have a general multidisciplinary look at conspiracy theories, which we had 7 postdoctoral fellows, and I had 2 co-collaborators, and anything from anthropologists to philosophers and so on. Couple of internet engineers, indeed, as well. So my part of that, as well as overall direction, was to look at these conspiracy theories. And what I discovered was really quite disturbing. So over the course of the grant, I wrote a number of essays that then became chapters, published them just last year.
Just for those readers who are not familiar, your book opens with an introduction where you talk about conspiracy theories. Specifically, you invoke the paranoid style in American politics by Richard Hofstadter as a major influence. But then you kind of focus on 5 conspiracy theories in particular. So I was just wondering, could you talk a little bit about those 5 conspiracy theories and why you drew specific attention to them? I should just say, for personal reference, the one that I thought was the most informative was this myth of the stab in the back, which, as you point out in various things, motivated the rise of Nazism. Although the one that I thought was the most, shall we say, kooky, was the stuff about Hitler being alive.
And UFOs.
Well past 1945. And the UFOs and the Arctic bases, or Antarctic, bases.
Yeah.
Well, of course, and I started thinking about conspiracy theories. There are a couple that are supposed to influence the Nazis in a very big way. One of them was the so-called Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is an anti-Semitic forgery, which historians have claimed had an enormous influence on Hitler, basically supplied him with what one of them called a warrant for genocide, and inspired him to launch and carry out the Holocaust. And I began to look rather critically at that one, and there's been a lot of new work on the protocols in the last few years, so I incorporated that, and that's the first chapter. And then the second one is about what you call the stab in the back. That's the idea. As I should say, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion it propagates the theory of a world Jewish conspiracy to undermine Western and especially German civilization. And the second one was Stab at the Back, which was the idea that had a lot of currency on the German extreme right in the 1920s, after World War I, that the German army had not been defeated on the Western Front in World War I, but it had been stabbed in the back by the Home Front, or in another more narrow version, the socialists on the Home Front, and even more extreme version, the Jews on the Home Front. So I looked at that and tried to unravel it and look at its influence. That's been made responsible, for example, for the fall of the Weimar Republic, the democracy that ruled Germany between the war and Hitler's rise to power. And there's a different kind of conspiracy theory, which is a conspiracy theories that I was a little bit more familiar with before I started, and that is conspiracy theories about the Nazi Germany and what went on. One of them is the Nazi deputy leader, Rudolf Hess, flew to Scotland on the 10th of May 1941 with a peace offer. And the evidence is that it was his own idea. He was trying to get back some of the power that he lost in the Nazi hierarchy, and he thought by concluding a peace with Britain before, just a few weeks before the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, Soviet, Poland, Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, he would manage to stop a war on two fronts, not the Nazi Germany fighting against the East and against the West, which he thought had proved so disastrous in World War I. And there are many conspiracy theorists, almost all of them in Britain, who claim that this was not his own madcap idea, but the result of a plot concocted with Hitler and others, or a plot that was hatched by the British to lure him over. And then I also look at conspiracy theories about the Reichstag fire. Now this is 28th of February 1933. Hitler has been appointed head of the German government, but it's a coalition with conservatives. He doesn't have dictatorial power. And the German parliament building, the Reichstag, burned down. He claimed it was a communist plot to stage a revolution and managed to get an emergency decree which essentially suspended civil liberties. And it was really the first cornerstone of his dictatorship. It's after that there were elections a few days later in which the communists were being arrested and weren't allowed to campaign. And they were a really big party in Nazi Germany. That was the beginning of the Nazi dictatorship. And again, there are conspiracy theories about it. The Nazis' conspiracy theory was that it was the communists who did it. And they put on trial a number of leading communists, but the courts hadn't been completely Nazified at that stage, and they dismissed the charges for lack of evidence. That left only one person who was tried and executed, and eventually executed, even though arson was not a crime at the time he committed it. That was a young Dutchman, Marinus van der Lubbe. On the other side, the communists believed it was a Nazi plot, and they staged a kind of mock trial in London, which found the Nazis guilty. And that is the conspiracy theory with legs. That's the one that has been revived consistently up until very recently, still believed in by many people. So I had a hard look at that.
I should say that when I was 12 years old, I actually believed that, in part because I watched a movie called Hitler: The Rise of Evil that heavily implied this, right? So
yes, that was interesting. There were two TV programs, part 1 and 2, Robert Carlyle as Hitler. And the first one had my friend and colleague Ian Kershaw, the biographer of Hitler, advising, and it was very good. But he resigned because they wanted to introduce too many fictional elements into it and were taking up too much of his time. And the second part is really terrible, and that's the one where they propagate the idea of the Reichstag being burned down by the Nazis. And then there's a final one, which is Hitler's supposed escape from the bunker to go and live in Argentina. And that's the final chapter. And then I wrap it all up by talking more generally about conspiracy theories. And what I wanted to do is to show how, by careful research and investigation, you can disprove conspiracy theories. And that is one way forward, I think, in a world where we're becoming slowly overwhelmed by conspiracy theories about all kinds of different things. I think historians have to stand up and be counted and say, no, this is bunk.
Yeah, I was actually curious if you could comment more about this kind of increase you said earlier in conspiracy theories as a historian, sort of like what has your experience been like seeing a change? Like, how would you describe the shift? Because I guess some of the things you mentioned in the book, right, it does seem like there's more of a cottage industry now of books being published by people, you know, on Amazon, self-publishing. And then also it seems like the History Channel really at the beginning, at its origin, you know, it really seemed like it was making a serious attempt to do history programming. And now it's pretty much always conspiracy theories. So maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there have always been conspiracy theories and there have always been conspiracies. Mm-hmm. And you find on all the subjects that I cover in the book, you can see conspiracy theories in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. For example, the alleged escape of Hitler from the bunker. You find that being propagated by Stalin, the Soviet leader, dictator, already just after the war, and it's occasionally revived. But like the other subjects I deal with, it's become much more common and much more widespread. And that, I think, is mainly the influence of the internet and social media.
Well, actually, I had a follow-up question then, just related to that, which is, you mentioned, earlier in this interview that there are two kinds of conspiracy theories that you address in the book. One is conspiracy theories that were either believed in or propagated by the Nazis, and the other are conspiracy theories propagated about the Nazis. The Hess incident and then Hitler surviving are the two main ones. So I'm just wondering if we could start by looking at the first a little bit. And can you explain the appeal of conspiratorial thinking, let's just call it that for right now, to the NSDAP? Why did it have traction in the party? What kind of conspiracies were they prone to believing, and what kind of ideological function did they serve?
Well, what I found was really, I think, interesting is that the Nazis were not great conspiracy theorists. Mm-hmm. If you look at Stalin, he sees conspiracies on every corner. Mm-hmm. And in fact, in the 30s, he staged these purges and show trials and executed a large number, most of his lieutenants, Zinoviev, Bukharin, and many others. And as partly because he came into politics in a period that was full of real conspiracies, whether you never knew who to trust. Before World War I, the treasurer of the Bolshevik party, Malinovsky, was actually a Tsarist police spy, for example. Mm-hmm. And so he didn't trust anybody. And he'd come up through the ranks, as it were. So when Lenin, the founder of the Soviet Union, died, Stalin was not his obvious successor. And he had to fight his way, maneuver and intrigue his way through all of these other prominent Bolsheviks, prominent communists, in order to get the supreme position. Hitler, so he was very suspicious of them, and he suspected them of plotting against him and arrested them and forced them to make confessions and had them killed. Now and everything went wrong in Soviet Russia, collectivization, industrialization, there were always things going wrong in these processes. And he chose to blame them going wrong, their failures and problems, on conspiracies, invented imaginary conspiracies, but that meant he let himself, as it were, off the hook. Now, Hitler's very different. Hitler emerges in the 1920s, and almost straight away, as soon as he becomes active in politics, is a leader. He's the leader, he's the leading figure. And there's never any question that his lieutenants, like Goering, Goebbels, Hess, and the others, were second rank. They owed their positions to him, they owed their allegiance to him. And so he didn't suspect them. In fact, the flight of Rudolf Hess came to Scotland, came as a terrible shock to him, as a lot of eyewitnesses who saw him getting the news have said. So he's not nearly as much a conspiracy theorist. Now, if you look in that context at the conspiracies which were kind of around, the theories that were around at the time of the Nazis, what I found with the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was that, in fact, it didn't have nearly as much influence as many historians have said. Mm-hmm. This was a document that was a purported to be the minutes of a meeting of Jewish elders in 1897 plotting the takeover of the world. It's a very peculiar document. It comes from Russia. It's translated into other languages, and it's propagated in English by Henry Ford, the motor manufacturer, who was a deeply anti-Semitic person. And the Protocols of the Elders of Zion were the Protocols of the Elders of Zion purported to be the minutes of a meeting of Jews in 1897 of elders, leaders who were plotting all sorts of terrible things. It's looked, if you look at the actual minutes, it's a very short book. They're very strange. They're not traditional Christian anti-Semitism. There's no mention of the so-called blood libel, the mention that Jews were kidnapping Christian boys to use their blood for ritual purposes, or the desecration of the host in the communion service in the Eucharist, or poisoning wells, or any of these things. There's no modern anti-Semitism either. It's not a racist document. The Jews are definitely treated as a religious community in it. And there's nothing about sort of Jewish racial characteristics trying to refute the ideas that you find with anti-Semites after you get the emergence of racist anti-Semitism in the late 19th century. So it's very much of its own kind. What it needed for people to understand it was to have commentaries on it and subheadings and notes. And they're the ones trying to relate it to modern politics in the 1920s and 30s that I think have the influence. But most of all, I probably don't think people read it very much. It's really quite difficult to follow and understand. Certainly not a dangerous, rabble-rousing piece of rhetoric. What they did was simply use it as so-called evidence from the Jewish community itself that they were plotting to take over the world. The idea that the Jews are taking over the world or ran the world or wanted revolutions and so on, that's around long before the Protocols. It goes right back to the time of the French Revolution, the late 18th century. Now, the crucial, and you find that Goebbels, Joseph Goebbels, who's Hitler's propaganda chief, actually didn't make use of it. His staff were always saying, you can't use this nonsense. It's just, it's so ridiculous. And Hitler doesn't mention it very much. And in fact, he mentions it after he's given his first anti-Semitic speech and his first anti-Semitic writings. So it's not, it doesn't influence him, in fact. It doesn't mention anywhere the idea of extermination, of mass murder. It's not a warrant for genocide. I think Norman Cohn, although he was a very brilliant writer, the first book serious book about the Protocols was called Warrant for Genocide, and I don't think that's really justified. But there are a lot more interesting things about the document. It's a forgery. It's a tissue of falsifications. It was exposed after the end of World War I, when it came to currency, by a reporter for the London Times in Istanbul. And he showed that it was cobbled together from a French satire against Napoleon III in the mid-19th century and a passage from a German Gothic novel and bits and pieces put into it by the Russian compiler, who was probably Pavel Khrushchevan, who had instigated a pogrom in Bessarabia involving the murder of 45 Jews, and he cobbled it together to try and justify that. That seems the most likely answer to who composed it, though we can't really be sure. And so it was a blatant forgery, and that was, it didn't come from the Jewish community at all. It was a falsification, and not a very good one either. And that was all confirmed in a trial held in Bern in Switzerland in the mid-1930s. Now, if you look at what Hitler and Goebbels said about it, they said, it doesn't really matter if it's true, if it really is the minutes of a meeting of Jewish elders or not. What matters is that it reveals, they thought, a deeper truth about the Jews. And that is that their racial characteristics, it's a pure racism here, incline them wherever they are, even unconsciously, Hitler says in Mein Kampf, to be subversive, to plot against Western civilization, to try and overthrow Germany, and so on. So the actual evidence doesn't really matter. They felt, they knew, in quote marks, that Jews were subversive. And that's a kind of pure racism. It's a particular kind of conspiracy theory, because it's not that there's a group of Jewish elders sitting in a room plotting everything. That doesn't work. Of course, what it does mean is, for them, for Hitler, the Nazis, that this is imbued in the Jewish character. Of course, complete nonsense, but that is that belief that the Jewish character was subversive, trying to destroy Germany, seemed to be confirmed by the protocols, fake or not, and that is what led to the Holocaust.
I had a follow-up question about this, and then I know, Victor, you had a few things that you wanted to ask. I just wanted to say for our listeners, some of you might remember that I'm a critic of Trump, and reading this section of your book where you talk about how, again, Hitler and Goebbels decide, doesn't really matter whether this is literally true because it expresses a kind of deeper spiritual truth, reminded me of some of the Trumpists who used to say that we don't need to take Trump literally, we just need to take him seriously, right? There was this kind of evocative quality to his rhetoric that expressed something more important than facts. But can you talk very briefly about the kind of way anti-Semitism was structured in Nazi thinking? Because one of the things that I've always found challenging about these doctrines, and I understand that they're vehemently racist doctrines and that they're nonsensical, but was how the Nazis simultaneously used to hold that the Jews were in charge of some kind of vast cabal or conspiracy, right, to control Germany and the destinies of the West or whatever it happens to be, while at the same time characterizing them as subhuman, parasitic, dirty, because there seems to be just such a blatant contradiction here that the mind wouldn't be able to hold to these two things at the same time. And yet so many millions of people did. So could you maybe speak to that briefly?
Yeah, there were many contradictions in Nazi ideology and anti-Semitism. And one of them was that Jews in the Nazi mind were simultaneously parasites below the level of normal human beings. But on the other hand, they were also incredibly dangerous and very, very powerful. There's a very good Jewish joke about this. It's in the Warsaw Ghetto during the war, and there are two old men, friends. One of them comes in and sees his friend there sitting reading the Nazi newspaper in the tram, in the streetcar. And he says, Moshe, what are you doing? Why are you reading the Nazi newspaper? And his friend looks up and says, well, I'm living a terrible life. You can't have food. I'm beaten by the Nazis. It's really dreadful. So once in a while, I buy the Nazi newspaper and I read there that we Jews are all powerful. We are incredibly influential. We've done this. We've done that. And that is a contradiction. There's another contradiction, of course. But I mean, let me deal with that one first. That is a contradiction because you resolve it by saying, well, look at, locusts. They can destroy whole countries, farmlands. Look at ants. They can kind of tear down houses and so on. So you can be simultaneously subhuman and superhuman. Again, the other contradiction is most obvious is that in Nazi ideology, Jews are said to control all kinds of things: banks, medical profession, the law, newspapers, all the rest of it. And they are said to be wealthy and parasites upon the German people. But at the same time, they're behind communism and socialism. And so if you say, well, hang on a minute, don't you think that communists and socialists were opposed to the big banks and the elites? And the Nazi answer to that is that that just shows how cunning they are. They're dividing the people against themselves. And that's a characteristic of conspiracy theories like that, is that they have an answer for everything. You cannot falsify them. Again, if you say these ideas are ridiculously untrue, they will simply say, well, you must be part of the conspiracy.
Yeah, I remember one figure when responding to accusations that the protocols of the Elders of Zion were falsified. I think it was Hitler actually said, well, the fact that people are making this accusation just goes to prove how big the conspiracy actually is, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And it's kind of like,
classic.
wow. Yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, you mentioned Hofstadter, and what we're dealing here was a paranoid style, as he called it. It's a great liberal writer of the 50s and 60s. And the paranoid style is one that kind of invents things, develops theories, paranoid theories and fantasies in order to account for an uncomfortable reality.
Right.
They invent it all. So none of the things we've been talking about has any bearing on reality at all. Of course, there were a few Jews who were among the socialists, but the majority were not, and they didn't have a disproportionate influence on the socialist and communist movements. Of course, there were some Jewish bankers, but the majority were not Jewish, and so on. You look at these things very carefully, and these theories crumble.
So, yeah, this actually segues nicely into one of the questions I had was, I think in the book you discuss some of the common tactics that conspiracy theorists tend to use, like they're kind of argumentative. I think, for example, in the last chapter, you bring up, I think you're quoting someone else talking about claim by association, claim by implication, arguments from silence, right? And I wonder if you could expand on some of those tactics and how they work argumentatively.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. If you look, for example, at conspiracy theorists who are writing about Rudolf Hess and his flight to Scotland with a bogus peace offer to Churchill, which was entirely his own invention. And you say, what about the evidence? And they will say, well, of course, the documents in the archives have been taken out. They've been weeded out in order to protect the British political elite or whoever it is. If you look at the or people involved, like the Duke of Kent, a member of the royal family, who died in a plane crash, that must have been deliberately caused in order to silence him because he knew too much. And again, you look at the Reichstag fire. Now, what is interesting about these two conspiracy theories is that in both cases, a single person was the root of events. So Rudolf Hess, there is no evidence that Hitler sent him. Hitler was shocked and surprised and depressed. There's no evidence that anyone tried to lure him over. It was entirely his own idea. There's a lot of evidence chronicling eyewitness accounts of Hitler being so shocked. Nobody else was involved. It was just Hess. Even the people who got the plane ready, put extra fuel tanks on it, and helped it take off and so on. They had no idea that he was going to fly all the way to Scotland. And of course, it's crazy because the Duke of Hamilton, whom he wanted to see, who was a leading figure in an Anglo-German friendship society, but not a pro-Nazi in any way, was not an important political figure. Hess completely got it wrong. It was another fantasy. But conspiracy theorists can't believe that it was all his own idea. And when you look at, you say, where's the evidence? Well, it's all been suppressed. The documents have been weeded out. People like Duke of Kent have been killed and so on. Exactly the same with the Reichstag fire, which I mentioned earlier. Now, the young Dutchman who was arrested and executed, Marinus van der Lubbe, he wasn't even a German. He wasn't even a member of the Communist Party. And the Nazis hang on him this blame for a vast conspiracy. I think if there had been a Nazi conspiracy, they certainly wouldn't have chosen someone like van der Lubbe. They'd have chosen a proper German communist. The people who believe it was the Nazis who started the fire, again, you ask them, where's the evidence that it was a plot? And apart from you sweep aside all the speculation and innuendo and invention that's common to these conspiracy theories, you say, well, what about, is there any documents? No, the documents have all been destroyed. Or what about the eyewitnesses then? Are the people who are in on the plot have all been killed? They were killed in the Night of the Long Knives in 1934. So you explain the lack of documentation as being a product of the conspiracy that you're positing. And I found those similarities really very, very striking and very telling, I think.
Yeah, it almost seems like they're using the lack of evidence, as stronger evidence, right? As like a sign that it's actually true, almost.
Exactly. These conspiracy theories are not really falsifiable in the normal sense of the word. There's always some explanation.
Exactly, and I also noticed, you made an observation about a lot of this sort of the cottage industry. I noted earlier of these, conspiracy history books that are showing up on Amazon, and these history channel documentaries where they use this tactic of speculation, right? They say this might have been where Hitler escaped to. This might have been. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's a wonderful review of a TV program alleging that Hitler escaped the bunker in 1945 and went to live in Argentina. That's, I think it's in Vanity Fair, that says, if you drank a whiskey every time they mentioned he might have been here, this might have happened, this could have happened, you'd be completely drunk by the end of the first ad break, So it's just a lot of speculation.
Yeah.
Joining the dots and in a way that's not supported by any evidence.
Yeah, well, this is actually where I thought it was very curious, and I kind of wanted to segue briefly to the present as we move closer to the end of the interview, because the last chapter, as mentioned, which concerns whether Hitler escaped the bunker, you mentioned that there's kind of not just a cottage industry, but almost an entertainment industry that's kind of emerged around this possibility. And people have movies, Hollywood productions, some higher budget, some not, where Hitler comes back and he's a zombie or he's tortured. Or I thought one that was really amusing is you mentioned there's this movie. It was I think produced by a German company where the Nazis established a base on a moon and then tried to reinvade Earth generations later. Iron Sky, yeah.
There's a lot of movies, The Boys from Brazil, for example. There's an Iron Sky. The Iron Sky is a truly terrible movie, and it's extremely entertaining. I've greatly enjoyed it. It has, I can recommend it. If you want to see every single cliche about the Nazis, all the way down to the blonde girl dressed in an SS uniform and wearing jackboots and so on, they're all there.
I'm 100% going to watch it. I thought it sounded hilarious. So.
This is fun. These are fun, but nobody takes them seriously. And what's different, I think, recently, including the 24-part series Hunting Hitler, is that they claim to be the truth. So people who claim that Hitler escaped to Argentina, simply dismiss all the massive investigations and research by historians, by a legal commission in Bavaria that sought to establish Hitler's death and issue a death certificate in the 1950s, by Hugh Trevor Roper, who went into this first, just after the war, by many others. There's a lot of evidence. The Russians, the Soviets wrote a report based on interviews with the two men who had burned Hitler and Eva Braun's bodies in the garden above the Reichstag, above the bunker, and others. All the eyewitnesses have been interviewed. All to tell the story. The outlines are very, very clear. But these are dismissed by the conspiracy theorists as official knowledge. So either they were not telling the truth, and that's not the case at all. No evidence of that. Or they were kind of, why should they have been suborned into saying Hitler was dead when he wasn't? There's no real reason behind it. Interestingly, Eva Braun, who became Hitler's wife, his long-term companion, was a professional photographer, and she took home movies, photographs of Hitler and his entourage, mostly in their mountain retreat in Bavaria, right away up to the last stage of the war. Not a single photograph has survived after the war. There's no evidence of his having been seen by anybody. It's all secondhand hearsay. My mother had a friend who says she saw Hitler kind of stuff. Nothing is corroborated. There's even a woman who's produced this as having irrefutable, direct evidence that Hitler survived. She was working in a house, doing sort of cooking and serving and so on, where a mysterious German visitor appeared, and she wasn't allowed to see him in Argentina. She had to leave his meals outside the door, and the chauffeur who worked for the house whispered to her, "This is Hitler, it's Hitler." So the meals she left were kind of, she said, typical German food. She never saw the guy. So the food that she made for him was Wiener Schnitzel, sausages, all that kind of stuff. Well, Hitler was a vegetarian. He was a confirmed vegetarian. He would never have touched sausages or Wiener Schnitzel. He had terribly bad teeth. His breath must have smelled dreadful. But he didn't touch it. It's all fantasy, and she never saw him, so that's not confirmation, is it? Not evidence at all. So who's peddling this stuff? Well, there's a number of different motives. We all love a good conspiracy story. I mean, some of my favorite movies, like the Bourne movie.
Oh, I knew I'd like you. I'm a big fan too.
They're great fun. But it's a different matter when you claim that this is the truth, this is what really happened. People are fascinated by it. I think there's a strong dose of admiration for Hitler here. Here was a man who started World War II, was responsible for the Holocaust. He was a world historical genius, even if you think he was an evil genius. So he can't possibly be die this squalid death in a hole in the ground. He shoots himself in the temple just before the Red Army arrives, and then the body is burnt and so on. He must have fooled the Allies somehow. And what's the interesting thing about this, the evidence is non-existent. He's supposed to have flown out of Berlin, no evidence at all, and highly unlikely since Berlin was a heap of rubble and you couldn't land a plane there at the end in late April. There must have been a body double. He must have left earlier. Was absolutely zero evidence for that. And it's particularly suspicious because the man who's put that theory forward also argued that Rudolf Hess's body was not Rudolf Hess, and Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, he was not, his body was not Himmler, and so on. So the evidence is entirely lacking. The submarine that's supposed to have taken Hitler to Argentina turns out to have been sunk before the end of the war. One other submarine has been identified was carrying a cargo of cigarettes. Well, he didn't smoke and didn't allow smoking in his presence. And I go through all of these theories. There's admiration for Hitler, and I think some desire to make a bit of money. This is a profitable enterprise, showing films and publishing books about Hitler's survival. And people enjoy reading them. Hunting Hitler had 3 or 4 million viewers per episode, so that's quite large. And that's even more important, I think, to present the evidence and question what they're saying.
I was wondering if I could ask you a question just as a historian more broadly, because, Matt and I are both political theorists effectively. We hang around with other philosopher types and theory types, and I think and I rarely find myself reading history. So, reading your book, I think one of the things that strikes me, and I'm reminded when I do go back to history, is the way the useful part of it is the way it reveals the human tendency to repeat patterns of thinking and behavior, I suppose. And, there's a couple examples that jump out in your book. I mean, the one that comes to mind that I was like, wow, is when you talk about how the Nazis conflate the Social Democrats with Marxists, right? And it reminds me of the way, Republicans, not to compare them to Nazis, but, that they will, conflate Obama with socialism or something like that. And I wonder if you had thoughts, or are there any of those examples of kinds of, repetition or human patterns of behavior that have stuck in your mind over your years as being a historian?
Yes, I should say the Social Democrats, who were the largest party before the Nazis in the Weimar Republic's democracy, were Marxists. They didn't jettison their Marxist view until well after World War II. They were not communists, however, and they were. And you have to remember, the Social Democrats and the communists between them won more votes than the Nazis did in the last 3 elections of the Weimar Republic in November 1932. But they were at dawn with each other. The Social Democrats were blamed by the communists for the assassination of their leaders, Liebknecht and Luxemburg, at the end of World War I, by right-wing troops actually employed by the Social Democrats who were in the government at the time. So what about these repetitions? Well, I think one thing that strikes me immediately is if you look at QAnon, this big conspiracy theory, which has garnered a lot of support, particularly amongst Trump supporters. You can see quite a few people amongst those who stormed the Capitol building on January 6th wearing QAnon T-shirts or carrying QAnon banners. This is a belief that even just talking about it seems ridiculous, but a belief that Donald Trump is secretly leading a movement to expose and destroy a worldwide conspiracy, particularly headed up by Democrats, Hollywood actors, George Soros and others, to kidnap boys and exploit them for sexual purposes, or to take adrenaline from them, knock them unconscious and extract adrenaline from them Now, this is very similar to a medieval a conspiracy belief that the Jews were taking blood from Christian boys that I mentioned earlier in our talk. I think it's connected to that in some ways. One connection might be the strength of extreme evangelical Christians in the pro-Trump movement. But whatever it is, of course, there's absolutely lacking in any evidence at all. It's just the similarity between the two beliefs is really quite striking.
Yeah, that actually reminds me, I read an article once that connected QAnon and also maybe traced back some of the medieval history you're mentioning to the Satanic Panic in the States of the 1990s, right? Where everyone was afraid in the 80s and 90s of heavy metal music, and there started to be these rumors that kids were being feasted on by these Satanists or whatever.
Yes, well, that's similar. I mean, but what is interesting is that QAnon has a very large anti-Semitic content to it. And therefore you find these kinds of beliefs are cropping up in it again. And white supremacism is also, of course, also anti-Semitic. Remember at the Charlottesville in 2017 in the big extreme right-wing demonstration, there were shouts of Jews will not replace us. This another conspiracy theory in our own time is the Great Replacement Theory, which alleges that the white race, as they like to say, is being replaced by other races in America, and those include Jews. And this is and you find these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, even, for example, in the belief that the Rothschild banking company, a Jewish firm, international Jewish firm, is sponsoring laser beams to come from satellites going around the Earth, which started the California fires. And again, that's connected to this kind of conspiratorial interpretation of the effects of global warming, right? Which again, of course, global warming, global heating skepticism is a serious and widely held belief on the right in American politics.
So one of the interesting characters that appears near the end of your book, who you point out, we've deviated some ways from the kind of Hitler survival myth here, is Jerome Corsi, who has deeper links in the American kind of conspiratorial right, including to people like Alex Jones, who I should say was my first encounter with some of these conspiracy theories, because one of my roommates was doing his PhD in film and kind of had an interest in some of this eccentric stuff that was emerging online. And Jerome Corsi, pushed forward this idea, certainly that Hitler survived in Argentina. He also has 9/11 truther beliefs. But the way that he kind of frames all this is quite interesting to me, because he positioned himself as kind of anti-establishment figure, as you point out, right? That he was challenging the official history because what was actually happened was being occluded from us by this mysterious cabal of different figures. And I did think that was an interesting and persistent theme in your book, this notion of the conspiracy theorist is somehow unraveling a truth that's been deliberately concealed from us. And it has this kind of heroic quality to it. And I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit to that. And do you think maybe that's one of the reasons people find conspiracy theories enticing? There's this notion of being a heroic vanguardist figure who's opposed to this kind of technocratic, bureaucratic, official history, as it's sometimes called.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as you see the phrase official history, you've got a conspiracy theorist there. This idea that the entire historical profession, journalists, newspapers, the media, they're all working for some unnamed, mysterious group of people, whether it's government or not. They don't have minds of their own. Now, I find that's deeply insulting to historians like myself. I make up my own mind about what happens and what goes on. And it's a dismissal of massive amounts of detailed research carried out by professionals over many, many decades. The conspiracy theorists said, no, this is just all rubbish. So you find people who simply, I think, without having read any of it, dismiss the accounts of Hitler's death in 1945 as official knowledge and say there's no real research or evidence, whereas in fact there's mountains of it. Mm-hmm. But because it's been done by mainstream historians, they dismiss it. And that's a kind of self-validation for them. You often find that conspiracy theorists, not always, but you often find that they are marginal in some way, or they feel cheated, or they feel shut out from the political process, or they feel like losers. And this is a way of reassuring themselves that we know better. We know the real truth. You, the official knowledge purveyors, you don't. I think that's very interesting on the part of Trump supporters, some of them, who won't accept that Trump actually lost the election in November 2020 fair and square. It must have been a conspiracy to defraud the American public. Jerome Corsi is an interesting character. He's
that's for sure
pro-Trump. He wanted to lead back. He hasn't. He's been involved in the Trump movement and also with InfoWars and with Alex Jones. He wants to lead back the Obama regime, and particularly the Affordable Care Act, to the Nazis. He wants to say this is a Nazi plot. And so he says that the American state, or the deep state, which is another classic conspiratorial phrase, the deep state basically took over a lot of Nazi ideas and helped through the CIA or the OSS, its predecessor, helped Hitler to escape and took on his ideas, and basically, therefore, the Affordable Care Act is Nazi. It's a complete fantasy and totally absurd. But Corsi has had some influence. He began his political career with allegations against John Kerry as a presidential candidate.
Swift boat stuff, yeah,
which turned out to be totally fabricated.
Yeah. So my last question for you, and then Victor, I know you have a few things that you wanted to say, was actually with regard to an article you wrote in the New Statesman this year, where you argued against some quite prominent public intellectuals like Jason Stanley and Timothy Snyder that Trump is not, in fact, a fascist. Although, as you point out, consistently, he's still very dangerous, and we'd be better off seeing the back of him, right? Now, I have my own kind of stake in this since I wrote a book about Trump, and I characterize him as a postmodern conservative. And I'm sure plenty of our listeners are tired of hearing about that, so I won't bore you with the details. But can you just kind of articulate your argument for why Trump is not a fascist? Because I've encountered many people who aren't just insistent that he is, but they seem to feel that it's important to label him as such. I mean, Victor, you talked about this yesterday, right? That there's a kind of visceral force in associating him with this movement that we can't deny.
Yeah. The idea of labeling somebody fascist, of course, discredits them far more than anything else in the view of people who call Trump a fascist. Just like calling, calling a camp for illegal immigrants Auschwitz or a concentration camp. I mean, you use the most extreme rhetoric to express your disapproval most strongly, but I think we need to be a bit more careful about the concepts we use and how we deploy them. So if you look back at Hitler and Mussolini, you find that what was central to their movements, the Italian fascism, and of course to German Nazism, which borrowed a lot from it, is war, militarism, uniforms, invasion and conquest of other countries. And when they achieved power, the total coordination and takeover of society and the regimentation of society and the militarization of society. Now, I don't see any of that in Trump. Trump's movement is a chaotic movement based on, I would say, warped and exaggerated ideas of the freedom of the individual. It's exactly lack of government control that they want to impose. He's been withdrawing troops from other countries. It's isolationist in many ways. You can see the opposite of genuine fascism in a lot of what Trump has done. What he is, I think, is an American populist in the style of American populism going way back with many other examples. Anti-democratic, dictatorial, and of course, opposed to neutral justice, opposed to free media, all of these things. But that doesn't make him a fascist. He's a populist. All fascists were populists, but not all populists are fascists. And I think we need to identify what he is, where he comes from, and what he's doing before we can actually take action. It's no use fighting the battles of yesterday. We're not fighting Hitler or Mussolini. We're fighting Trump, if that's the side that you're on. And I think you also have to situate him in this new era of mass information, mass disinformation, overload of information, the bypassing of the traditional gatekeepers of opinion, fact checkers, editors, producers of newspapers, radio, TV programs, and so on. The internet bypasses all of them. And that is where we are at the moment. And I think we need to recognize that and take steps. For me, the most important thing is to try and curb and stop the flow of misinformation that is coursing across the internet like sewage and drowning us all.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, for sure. That resonates a lot with me. For a while, I've been arguing that the fascist label, it gives people, it kind of lets people off the hook from actually explaining what's bad about Trump in specific terms in a way. And there's a temptation. I mean, not to conflate it with conspiracy theories at all, but I guess I see like there's a human tendency to want simple black and white answers. And I think maybe tendency to fascism is similar to people's temptation towards some conspiracy theories, which I think at one point in your book you talk about as being black and white answers.
That's right.
Yeah, so I did have another question about back to the conspiracy theory from the book. Let me just see here. So at the end of your book, in the conclusion, at the beginning of the conclusion, you make a really interesting claim that I think touches something really important about the nature of conspiracy theories, and you say that that in some ways they're a result, in many ways of, I think you say, a product of modern science scholarship, appearing to share their most common structure and modes of argument, while at the same time radically challenging them. And I thought that was really interesting, and I wonder if you could speak more about that. Well,
because it varies, I mean, so if you've got on the on Twitter, you can't really make any serious arguments at all on Twitter. But books, articles, which have been published by conspiracy theorists about things like the assassination of JFK or 9/11 or the ones that I deal with, you find that they are replete with all the kind of apparatus of modern scholarship. They're overloaded with footnotes. They're obsessed with tiny details, which they then blow up into things that are much more important than they really are. I mean, take one example, okay? In the flight of Rudolf Hess, there are a lot of, we know pretty well. There's the records of one sort or another by radar stations, by the Royal Air Force, and by others, of the plane that he flew, where it was at any given time, on its way from Germany across the North Sea to Scotland, Western Scotland. So it flew over a lot of land as well. Now, there's little discrepancies in some of the timings. You tell a couple of minutes here, a couple of minutes there. Different sources disagree. And this is blown up by some conspiracy theorists into an argument whether, the evidence is all falsified, it's all wrong. But in fact, people didn't have electronic watches. They depended on clockwork and on often rather inaccurate timepieces. So it's not surprising there were discrepancies. So that kind of detail, and you find pages and pages and pages of this stuff.
So I guess one other question I had was, like, maybe you touched on it a little bit, but I was kind of just curious for my own curiosity. Do you have a favorite of the outlandish Hitler survival conspiracies that you come across in your book?
Yeah, I love the one where he is taken by a Nazi flying saucer equipped with anti-gravity to go to a secret base underneath the Antarctic and stay there, sending out flying saucers occasionally to see if it's safe to come back into the world. That's my favorite.
Exactly. And I guess one last thing would be, you've spoken to it, the current context of the internet being like a real cesspool, pushing sewage of conspiracy theories. I did wonder, though, there's also a growing proliferation of debunking conspiracy theories, but on the whole, I guess you would say things are a lot worse of a situation today than they've ever been, you think?
Well, people began the internet and the World Wide Web with incredible optimism. This is going to democratize knowledge and so on. And it has done that. Think of now, it's just so much easier to look up accurate, documented information than it was like 30 years ago when you had to go to libraries and archives and all the rest of it. And there are a lot of fact-checking websites out there. If you think of Holocaust denial, the denial, extreme right-wingers denial that 6 million Jews were killed and the gas chambers are used and so on, you can find websites now that present huge amounts of information to disprove that conspiracy theory, that's all been invented or suppressed. But at the same time, there's an underbelly of knowledge transmission, which is disinformation. Not to mention, of course, the huge amounts of violent, pornographic, and hatred-filled and other kind of content that's come over the internet. And that I don't think the people who set the internet up really bargained for. And that is, I think, what society has to grapple with. I think a beginning has been made. I do think that barring Trump permanently from Twitter has been the most serious blow he's received, apart from his not being elected in the United States. So, but I think it's a long way to go. I think there's a lot more things that need to be done.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think of websites like Snopes, which has been around for a while. If you're familiar with it, right? It debunks, I think, conspiracy theories. Yeah, it's a good resource. But in any case, I guess maybe lastly, just off the top of my head, are you working on any new projects at this point?
I'm writing a book called Hitler's People and researching it, which is about, it's done through individual short biographies, trying to explore why people supported Hitler, starting with his immediate entourage, like Goering, Goebbels, Hess, Lai, and so on, and then moving on to middle-ranking Nazis and then down to ordinary supporters. So I'm about a third of the way through doing it, and I hope it will appear in 2023.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Evans. We really appreciate it. Again, check out his new book, Hitler Conspiracies. Again, if you have any interest in the Second World War, you'll find it an illuminating resource. And if you're interested in contemporary politics, which was what really surprised me about it, you'll probably learn something as well. So I hope you have a fantastic day. And again, thank you so much for coming on to our channel.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Great, thank you.
Bye-bye, Professor.
Here we go, bye-bye.